Barbara Garrity-Blake didn't set out to learn about Menhaden. She was just a cultural anthropologist fascinated by the people who work the water. But then she stumbled into a world that was vanishing, a world of fish factories, African-American crews singing shanties to haul nets heavier than houses, and a smell so potent, towns called it the smell of money. Menhaden are these not-so-appealing fish that were still once the lifeblood of coastal North Carolina's economy. They fed the soil, the livestock, even the crabs. But the industry is now gone. Its fleets vanished. The shanties all but silent. That leaves an obvious question. Was it overfishing, tourism, or something deeper, like letting a way of life purposefully slip away? I'm Ren Smith, and welcome to Shoreside, where we tell stories about coastal North Carolina.
And we'll be talking about fisheries, right? Okay. All right. So my name is Barbara Garrity-Blake. I am a cultural anthropologist specializing in fisheries. I live in Gloucester, North Carolina, which is in the down east part of Carteret County, east of Beaufort. I am currently president of NC Catch, which is a nonprofit that advocates for local seafood, for local food systems, and for the people who provide us access with local seafood. I teach marine fisheries policy at the Duke Marine Lab. I've always been fascinated with people, what makes people tick. And I think I was drawn to coastal / fisheries communities in particular because I was an undergraduate at Florida State University in Tallahassee. And one of my brothers started commercial fishing out of Apalachicola. He was a snapper grouper fisherman. So I just used to, spend many weekends visiting him and his wife. And it just struck me that it was such a unique and rich culture around seafood, around commercial fishing.
Barbara's research and 1995 book, The Fish Factory, takes us back to the heyday of North Carolina's menhaden industry.
So this industry, it first came to the South after the Civil War when Yankee industrialists had heard reports that there were large rafts, if you will, of menhaden offshore of North Carolina. Menhaden are such a prolific fish that when you are flying along the coast and you look down and there are schools of menhaden, it looks like almost like an oil spill. What are those giant blobs in the water? But those are fish and they hang together. They swim in these tightly packed schools so they set up processing centers here, factories. We call them fish factories, and started the industry. These fish factory towns like Southport, North Carolina was a big fish factory town. Beaufort, North Carolina, Morehead City, North Carolina. These fish factory towns, menhaden was the lifeblood of these towns. Everybody worked for the fish factories or they were support for the fish factories, the grocery stores, the fuel docks, everything.
But here's the thing about menhaden. When it comes down to it, they're really not all that appealing.
Yeah. So menhaden is, it's like the largest fishery nobody's ever heard of. And I think it's because it's not a seafood. So a menhaden is a fish. It's a fish that is part of the herring family. So it is a very bony, oily fish that by and large has not been consumed as seafood per se. If you go all the way back to pre-contact colonial days, there were native groups that used menhaden to fertilize their gardens. So menhaden is the corruption of an Algonquin word that means that which makes things grow. They look similar to a shad, but the distinctive feature of a menhaden is there's a spot on its tail, and sometimes there's more than one. There's some spots along the menhaden's body. It's a very soft fish, so when you catch them, they start rotting really fast. And it's just, again, because of the oil content.
Menhaden also have a distinct, some would say, off-putting smell, and that's not all.
The scientific name is Brevordia tyrannus, or, tyrannus refers to tyrant. And they got that scientific name because there's this, oh my gosh, I'm an anthropologist, not a biologist, so I don't remember if the term is copepod or isopod. There's this little crustacean bug that lives in its mouth. And this bug sits there and is a parasite. And the bug eats the plankton as the menhaden, filters all that plankton into its mouth. And so that's how it got its name, Brevordia tyrannus. Sometimes these bugs are there so long that the fish's tongue will actually wear away, and the bug itself functions as the fish's tongue.
As opposed to gracing our tables, menhaden had other uses.
The value of this fishery, people discovered, was really in processing the fish for the oil and the meal itself.
But the work was brutal.
These African American crews in the South, they began getting recruited on these vessels because it's such a labor-intensive fishery. Back in the day, they were big wooden steamers. These vessels go out into the ocean. The fish themselves like to stay close to shore because they're plankton feeders. Therefore, they're in waters that are too shallow for these larger vessels. The crew get in these littler purse boats where they can get into some shallower waters. And the purse boats are connected by a tremendous net that's called so the purse boats will split up and they will corral the fish, spreading this net out between the vessels. Once they spread out and then come back together, they have enclosed a portion of the school of fish within this purse net. Then they drop a weight, and the weight purses the bottom of the net. So the fish can't swim out of the net. They can't go below the water and swim out of the net. They're in a big corral. And so then the process is the fishermen call it tightening the net. So they'll pull it over into deeper water where the mothership is, and then they'll start pulling in the net to concentrate the fish into a more manageable ball of fish. So you would have 20 up to 30 men working together, pulling in a seine net that can have tens of thousands of fish in it. So if you can imagine how heavy that must be. And that was pre-technology. It was only by hand, only by human strength alone. When the net was too heavy to pull, these African American crewmen would start raising the fish with song. They would start singing these shanties. And so it was not only to help time their efforts because they all had to pull together, but fishermen say that it generated a certain power, a certain strength to allow them to lift what otherwise couldn't be lifted with human strength alone.
Barbara was captivated.
When I was doing my research, there were still plenty of menhaden fishermen around who remembered back in the day when they depended on singing these shanties to lift these heavy netfuls of fish. And so they would sing them for me. And it was just really beautiful. And I want to tell you, it's not like the yo-ho-ho in a bottle of rum. shanties that we're familiar with Hollywood movies. These Menhaden shanties were like church. These men would sing, alto, bass, soprano, and it was the call and response style that you find in some West African areas. It just fascinated me to no end. You get goosebumps when you hear them, but the content really was pretty diverse. Some shanties were about missing home, missing family life, missing their woman. Other shanties, songs of resistance, where they would sing right in front of the captain, "Captain, all your men gonna leave you on the next payday. We're gonna leave you on the next payday." That was just a way to express themselves that was just sort of part of the work process.
Then, in the 1960s, machines replaced muscle.
And they stopped singing the shanties in the early 1960s when they introduced hydraulic net lifting devices. So that's called a power block. When they started using the power block, there was just no need.
Even as Black crews did the heaviest work, the leadership and profits in the Menhaden business were mostly in white hands.
And so I expanded my research to understand the history of the fishery, the labor history, and the relationship between captains and crewmen and the factory owners.
By the 1980s, a new conflict emerged, not over labor, but as king mackerel.
I mean, we no longer have a fishery and a fish processing center in North Carolina. That stopped in 2005. We had two factories running right in Beaufort, but in the mid-'80s, contending that these boats catch such a large quantity of menhaden, which is a keystone species which other fish like to eat, that they were breaking the food chain and causing the decline in mackerel. And they weren't catching enough mackerel to make them happy.
There was also another problem, that smell again.
But getting back to smell, when you cook these fish, when I say processed menhaden, what these factories do is they cook them. And then they press the fish and they get the oil out of it. And then the solids continue on to a dryer. The solids get dried and then they get grinded into a fine powder. It almost looks like baby powder in the end. It's that fine. But when they are processing, you can smell menhaden. You can smell this fish. The townspeople used to say the smell of menhaden is the smell of money. It was their primary occupation. Coastal economies have changed quite a bit and really started changing in the 70s with tourism, 80s, 90s. Of course, I came in the 80s with, tourism and more recreational fishing, hence the conflict. And then today, you're hard pressed to find an area that is secluded enough that could support a fish factory because when they're cooking, you smell it. People just objected to that. And
So these days, purse fishing within 1.5 miles of the North Carolina coast is illegal. Menhaden are still out there, swarming in colossal schools off the coast, but the factories, the jobs, the song, gone. The industry's stronghold is now in Reedville, Virginia, where a single plant processes most of the Atlantic catch.
what fascinated me more than anything about the conflict that was going on were these recreational fishermen were very concerned in the ecological impact of menhaden fishing. And so what was interesting to me was that the biology contradicted that. The folks at the NOAA lab, menhaden has been tracked longer than any other fishery in the United States. That was one of the first fisheries they began monitoring and tracking. And it's just such a prolific fishery that it was not overfished. So it was more of a perception that, look at these big nets, look at them pumping these menhaden out of that net. But in fact, the science said otherwise. And I have to tell you, to this day, this controversy still rages on.
And That's the story here. It's not just about fish. It's about what happens when an industry built on community gets priced out by progress. When the ocean stays the same, but the world around it doesn't. People and entire communities, they get displaced. Smith, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks to Barbara Garrity-Blake for sharing her insight and stories from North Carolina's maritime past. We're also deeply grateful to the Library of Congress for preserving and providing access to historical recordings of Menhaden shanties, one of which you heard in this episode. Learn more about Shoresides at shoresides.org.